Hi everybody. The Doldrums. We are on chapter 9. Let's go, okay? So Mrs. Merkley marched across the room without acknowledging a single student. She plopped her bag and a stack of papers on the desk and proceeded to stare out the window for a few moments. The students exchanged glances. Everyone seemed to be thinking the same thing. Did she see us? Thought Charlie H. Brimble. Is she blind? Thought Molly S. Mellings. She needs a new dress, thought Alice P. Suggins. The other students knew nothing about their new teacher. Archer did. And he couldn't believe his luck, if luck is the right word. He had managed to avoid being seen by Mrs. Merkley all summer long. Now she stood before him in all her glory, and he was certain she would do a number on him. He lowered his head to the desk behind a well-fed boy named Digby Figg. Mrs. Merkley left the window to assume her position in front of the class. She studied the young faces looking back at her and appeared to dissect them, one by one. After preliminary once-over, she began. "My name is Mrs. Merkley," she announced without ceremony, "and it's quite clear in looking at all of you that your feeble Mrs. Thimbleton has been running a rather loose ship. This changes now." Before she could continue, Alice raised her hand. Mrs. Merkley twisted her head in the girl's direction. "A problem already?" she asked. Alice shook her brightly beaming head from side to side. "First of all," she said, "I wanted to say that I love your dress. I also wanted to be the first to welcome you to our school. My name is Alice, and I will be glad to assist with anything you might need." Mrs. Merkley's smile was not one to warm the cockles of your heart. "A kind gesture, my dear Alice," she replied, "and I have one for you as well. I shall place you at the very top of my list." Alice allowed herself a proud smile. "Thank you," she replied. Mrs. Merkley's laugh didn't warm the cockles either. "And why, may I ask, are you smiling?" she snorted. "Because," Alice hesitated, "because it's good to be on top." "Yes, I'm sure that's the case elsewhere in this school," said Mrs. Merkley, "but I can assure you that in here it's the very last place you'll want to be. Now, are you quite finished with your little routine?" Alice blushed. "What routine?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Merkley soured. "Honestly, Alice, you love my dress, do you?" She turned to the rest of the class. "I would like everyone to take good note of this. Our dear Alice is a perfect example of why you mustn't spend too much time in the sunlight. Now put your elixirs away, I'm not buying anything, and pipe down. I don't want to hear another word from you." The students shifted in their seats. For reasons Archer couldn't figure out, Charlie Brimble threw up his hand. "What's he doing?" whispered Archer. "Committing suicide," whispered Oliver. Mrs. Merkley groaned. "Can't I get 2 words out before you all start laying your issues at my feet?" Charlie lowered his hand a little. "Come now, String Bean," Mrs. Merkley continued. "Tell us your problem. Clothes can't find enough hip or shoulder to grab onto. Whatever it is, I can't promise results, but I'll roll up the sleeves and try my best." With the entire class and Mrs. Merkley now glaring at him, Charlie's thoughts bounced around like an egg being hard-boiled. He tried. Mrs. Merkley shook her head. "This place is far worse than I thought," she said. "I've seen tree stumps with greater cognition." She folded her arms and tapped her foot while waiting for Charlie to say something, but it's awfully difficult to think once your thoughts have been hard-boiled. All Charlie managed was, "Never mind." Mrs. Merkley grinned. "Very good," she chirped. "I sense improvement in you already. Still, let's put you in a slot number 2 on my list so Alice won't feel alone. Now, where was I?" Mrs. Merkley looked out at the sea of students and caught sight of Archer. Archer still had his head lowered to his desk, and while some adults might struggle to tell the difference between a boy and a plank of wood, Mrs. Merkley was a professional and well-versed in the defining aspects of each. "It's all in the grain," she'll tell you. "A boy will have countless more knots than a plank of wood." Something peculiar happened when Mrs. Merkley saw him. He assumed she would be furious. He'd sent her to the hospital after all. The strange thing was, she didn't look angry, not in the least. It was just the opposite, in fact. She appeared downright gleeful, as though she might burst at the seams, and he would have to duck as chunks of Merkley soared over his head. Archer's palms grew sweaty. "Alfred," she cried. "Oh, yes, I did so very much hope to see you in my class. I take back what I said about Mrs. Thimbleton. She's a clever lady, that one. Thought you did away with me, did you?" The students twisted their necks to stare at Archer. "And it goes without saying," Mrs. Helmsley had said just before Archer left the house that morning, "that if you see Mrs. Merkley, you will apologize." While engaging this woman a second time was the last thing Archer wanted to do, he took a deep breath, raised his head, and tried his best to explain the accident. "Accident?" repeated Mrs. Merkley. "You want me to believe it was an accident? That's rich, my dear. Chocolate fudge, that is. So you accidentally fell asleep with your head inside a polar bear's mouth, and you accidentally rolled a glass eye from that mouth. I see. And then you accidentally tried to explode my heart." The student exchanged grins. They were fascinated. Mrs. Merkley turned to them. "Tell me," she said, "has anyone here accidentally fallen asleep with their head inside a polar bear?" Not a single hand went up. "I wouldn't think so," said Mrs. Merkley. She clasped her hands and flashed Archer a poisonous smile. "But perhaps you're right, Alfred. Perhaps the whole ordeal was an accident, as you say. Yes, your family does have a rather peculiar history of Arctic-related accidents, don't they?" Archer bit his tongue and turned a light mauve, sorry he'd opened his mouth. Oliver began poking him in the back. He knew what it meant. It meant, don't do something foolish and get yourself thrown out a window or shipped off to Ravenwood. But as Mrs. Merkley took a few steps in their direction, the poking stopped. "Yes, perhaps it was an accident," Mrs. Merkley continued. "But today is a new day. Today we put this accidental lifestyle of yours up on the shelf. Today we replace it with purposeful existence. That's the task I see before me. That's why I'm here. That's what brought me to your doorstep. There's hope for you yet, my dear boy, and I must try my best, for we shall all very much hate to see you go the way of the iceberg like those loons." Archer's toes curled, and he bubbled with anger. "They're not loons," he said quietly behind clenched teeth. "What's that?" asked Mrs. Merkley. "I said they're not loons." "But of course they are, my dear. Even you must see that." She addressed the class once more. "Has anyone here had a family member float out to sea atop an iceberg?" No one raised a hand. Mrs. Merkley gave a thoughtful nod. "Why does this not surprise me?" she asked. "Ah, yes, because normal people don't float out to sea atop icebergs, do they?" "Normal people don't shout at the moonlight," cried Oliver. At least that's what Oliver thought about doing. In truth, Oliver was looking the opposite way, trying his best to disassociate himself from Archer. Across the room, Adelaide watched in amazement. Adelaide was no stranger to nastiness. Her mother, you'll remember, was most unpleasant, and she could sometimes still taste Mr. Standish's rusty rules, and of course there were the attacks from the petite raps. But Mrs. Merkley was not a petite rap. Mrs. Merkley was a mouse king. At least that's how the ballerina saw it. And while she knew nothing of this Alfred or his polar bear or the iceberg, she didn't like what she was seeing. So before Mrs. Merkley could say another word, Adelaide cleared her throat and said, "Pardon, Mrs. Merkley." Mrs. Merkley spun around. "Who called out like that?" she snapped. Adelaide raised her hand. Jaws dropped all around, and though no one said a word, they were all thinking the same thing. "It's the crocodile girl." Mrs. Merkley left Archer's desk, marched across the room, and raised herself to her full height. Adelaide, already a trifle small for a girl her age, looked even smaller beneath the behemoth, but she stared back without hesitation. Mrs. Merkley's ears went pink. This one would be trouble. "First of all," she said, "the name is Merkley, not Merkley. Second of all, there are rules in this classroom, my dear. I will not tolerate you calling out willy-nilly like this." I'm sorry, said Adelaide. This is my first day in a real school. Mrs. Merkley blinked and tilted her head. What do you mean this is your first day in a real school? I lived in France, Adelaide replied. I wasn't able to attend school. There are no schools in France? There are plenty, said Adelaide, but I was tutored. Too troubled to attend a proper institution, no doubt, Mrs. Merkley snipped at the same moment she noticed Adelaide's leg. Very troubled, I see. Where's your other leg? Are you trying to make me look extravagant for going out on two? Adelaide shook her head while suppressing a smile. No, Mrs. Merkley, she replied. I don't think you're extravagant. A few brave students giggled. Mrs. Merkley's pink ears drained into her face and deepened in hue. She couldn't tell if the girl was being coy, but that didn't matter. Mrs. Merkley was clearly losing her patience. I knew you were going to be trouble, she snapped. Yes, the very moment I introduced myself and saw you staring out that window with your head up in the clouds. Mrs. Merkley lowered a hand to Adelaide's desk and positioned her head so close that Adelaide could count her nose hairs. From now on, you'll keep your mouth shut and that little head of yours inside this classroom where it belongs. Adelaide slowly turned and gazed out the window. But don't you think the clouds are very pretty, she asked. This small act of defiance had a tremendous effect on Mrs. Merkley. Her giant head flushed a brilliant red and her nostrils flared. She looked like she might blow a gasket. The other students tried their best to back away while still remaining in their seats. Gorgeous, Mrs. Merkley shouted. But if I instruct you to keep your head inside this classroom, you'll do well to obey. In France, said Adelaide, facing Mrs. Merkley once more, they tell us to be mindful with those who dictate head placement, because these could be the same people who someday tell you to stick it in a guillotine. You'll stick your head where I tell you to stick it, Mrs. Merkley demanded, in a guillotine or wherever. If you don't, there will be consequences. Adelaide nodded. But, she said slowly, what consequences would be worse than sticking my head in a guillotine? Mrs. Merkley sputtered and turned a color that was difficult to describe. Her lips were tight and her eyes were slits, and her heart beat wildly. Mrs. Merkley, a wildly beating heart was never a good thing. Adelaide sensed a problem. Are you all right? She asked. Mrs. Merkley pointed a shaky finger at her. Girls who are missing legs are in no position to question the wellness of others, she shouted, her voice cracking. But that was the end of it. Mrs. Merkley tramped to the front of the classroom and stood silently facing the blackboard. The students, who were still fixated on Adelaide, quickly spun around when they heard Mrs. Merkley sit down. It's always troubling for a woman like Mrs. Merkley when someone so much smaller gains the upper hand. It upsets the natural order of things. What's worse was Adelaide did so with no effort. The room was perfectly silent while Mrs. Merkley tried to regain her composure. When she finally stood up once more, her voice remained shaky. As this is the first day of school, she said, I think it best to be lenient, as I trust you've all observed. She lifted the stack of papers from her desk. Now, for reasons I won't pretend to understand, your head of school saw fit to send each class to the Rosewood Museum for a day of, she looked down and read, a day of on-site learning with lots of good cheer to welcome you all to a lovely new year. The entire class giggled, but a glance from Mrs. Merkley was enough to silence them all. She dropped a pile on the first desk of each row, and the students passed them back. And it said, the Willow Academy Rosewood Museum, a day of on-site learning with lots of good cheer to welcome you all to a lovely new year. This year, each class will spend a day at the Rosewood Museum. It is our sincere hope that this will inspire much productivity for the year. We are also excited to announce that the museum has partnered with the Rosewood Zoo, and each class will have a unique experience. As your basics teacher is Mrs. Merkley, you will go to the museum on Monday the 6th of October. In order to attend, please have your parents sign this slip and return it to your basics teacher. That's what that looks like. Make no mistake, Mrs. Merkley continued. I do not believe in such frivolity, and it will end with this trip. If your parents don't sign these slips, such frivolity ends now. She grabbed her bag and left the room before the morning break bell sounded. The students stared at one another as the air came back into the room. "What just happened?" Charlie asked. "This is going to be a long year," Alice said to Molly as they made for the door. Charlie ran after them. Archer was studying Adelaide, but quickly turned away when she smiled at him. "I have to go to the bathroom," he said, and stood up. "Good idea," said Oliver, following him out. "I think I might throw up, too." All right, have a great weekend. See you on Monday. I wonder what's going to happen next.